What really happens behind the iron bars of ADX Florence, America's most secure and notorious prison? With a reputation for housing the worst of the worst, its walls hide secrets that no one talks about. Inmates like Thomas Silverstein, locked away for decades in total isolation, have seen the inside of this hellish reality. But what's life really like when the doors close and the world fades away? Keep watching to find out, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a dark tale from the heart of America's prison system. The story of ADX Florence is one that begins long before its doors close behind the worst criminals this country has ever known. Set against the barren, empty landscapes of Colorado, this supermax facility was designed to be impenetrable, a place where even the most dangerous criminals would be locked away from society for good. Its mission? To house the most violent offenders in total isolation, never to be released again. But for many who end up here, it's more than just a prison, it's a death sentence. Constructed in the 1990s, ADX Florence stands as the crown jewel in the U.S. prison system's effort to control its most unruly inmates. Spread across 37 acres, this facility is home to the country's most infamous criminals, including terrorists, gang leaders, and the like. But it's not just the men housed here that make this prison so notorious. It's the conditions they endure, and the haunting question that has yet to be answered. What happens when the doors close and a person is left with nothing but their thoughts for decades? Among those who know this reality all too well is Thomas Silverstein, one of the most feared inmates in American prison history. A member of the Aryan Brotherhood, Silverstein was convicted of several murders, including the killing of a correctional officer in 1983. His violent actions led to his eventual transfer to ADX Florence, where he would spend the majority of his life in solitary confinement, 23 hours a day, locked away in a 7 by 12-foot cell. For 28 years, Silverstein's world consisted only of concrete walls, fluorescent lights, and the sound of his own breath. In the first few days of his imprisonment, Silverstein could have never imagined the depths of isolation he would experience. It wasn't just the absence of human interaction that made his life hell, it was the constant reminder that he would never be free. Unlike the other prisoners in ADX Florence, Silverstein's isolation wasn't just a temporary measure. His punishment would stretch on without end. A one-way ticket to a form of torture so extreme it would break the spirit of even the most hardened criminals. The concept behind ADX Florence was simple: to house the worst of the worst in the most secure conditions possible. This meant more than just keeping the inmates locked up, it was about erasing them from society entirely. The prison's design reflects this goal, with every detail tailored to ensure that no inmate would have any form of meaningful human contact. The cells, each measuring just 7 feet by 12 feet, are equipped with a small window, a concrete bench, and a stainless steel toilet. There is no privacy, no room to move, and no opportunity for a moment of peace. For inmates like Silverstein, the walls of their cells became their entire world. The only sound they would hear would be the hum of fluorescent lights or the occasional announcement over the intercom. There were no visitors, no family, no contact with the outside world. The physical isolation was only matched by the psychological isolation. Without human contact, without any form of sensory stimulation, the mind begins to wither. Silverstein's life, over time, became a blur of monotony, his days indistinguishable from one another. This is the brutal reality of life at ADX Florence. Despite the physical and psychological toll, ADX Florence's isolation tactics were seen by many as necessary to maintain control. The rationale was simple: these men were too dangerous to be housed anywhere else. But as time went on, it became clear that the consequences of such extreme measures were far more destructive than anyone could have imagined. The human cost was devastating, and it wasn't just the inmates who were affected. For the staff who worked in ADX Florence, the psychological toll was equally severe. The warden of ADX Florence, Robert Hood, once described the facility as a clean version of hell. His words echoed the sentiments of many who had spent time behind its walls. The brutality of ADX Florence extended beyond the inmates. Guards and staff often found themselves dealing with long-term trauma. Working in an environment where violence and despair were the norm had a profound impact on their mental health. The isolation was not just confined to the prisoners, it permeated every corner of the prison, affecting everyone involved. In 2012, Amnesty International released a report that examined the conditions at ADX Florence. The report condemned the prison's use of solitary confinement, citing the severe psychological harm it caused. Inmates were subjected to 23 hours a day in their cells, with little to no human contact. They were isolated from the world and deprived of any form of meaningful interaction. For many, this lack of human connection led to severe mental breakdowns, including depression, hallucinations, and suicidal thoughts. The impact on their mental health was irreversible for some. But it wasn't just Amnesty International that raised concerns. Over the years, numerous reports have surfaced from former guards, correctional officers, and even former inmates who have spoken out about the horrors of life in ADX Florence. These testimonies reveal a disturbing pattern of psychological abuse and mistreatment, one that continues to haunt the lives of those who lived through it. Even those who spent just a few years in the prison often reported long-term psychological damage that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. As for Thomas Silverstein, his time in ADX Florence was a life sentence of isolation. He spent the majority of his time in a small cell, completely cut off from the world. His only interactions were with the guards who brought him his meals or conducted the occasional cell search. Over time, Silverstein's physical health began to deteriorate. He suffered from high blood pressure, diabetes, and other medical issues. But perhaps the most significant toll was the one that could not be measured: the toll on his mind. Silverstein's story is one of tragedy, not just because of the violent crimes he committed, but because of the unimaginable suffering he endured behind the walls of ADX Florence. He lived through years of sensory deprivation, a life devoid of human touch, and the crushing realization that he would never be free. When he passed away in 2019, it marked the end of a long and painful chapter for a man who had become the symbol of total isolation. But the legacy of ADX Florence lives on. Its walls continue to hold some of the most dangerous men in the world, and its practices continue to be a point of controversy. Despite the growing evidence of the psychological damage caused by solitary confinement, the prison remains a model for how the United States handles its most dangerous criminals. The question remains, at what cost? Thomas Silverstein's story inside ADX Florence is not just one of extreme punishment, but also of the devastating consequences of a system designed to strip away everything that makes a person human. For over 28 years, Silverstein lived in solitary confinement, a condition that is widely regarded as one of the most brutal forms of imprisonment. As the years passed, Silverstein's mental and physical health deteriorated, and his life became a stark reminder of the damaging effects of long-term isolation. But what happened to a man like Silverstein, whose entire existence was defined by a 7 by 12-foot cell, with nothing but his thoughts for company? Silverstein's journey into isolation began in 1983, when he was accused of killing a prison guard at the Marion Penitentiary in Illinois. After this violent act, he was transferred to ADX Florence, where the highest security protocols were in place to ensure that he and other inmates would never pose a threat again. It was in this remote Colorado prison that Silverstein would be subjected to an unthinkable form of punishment: solitary confinement. Solitary confinement at ADX Florence was not just a temporary measure. It was a permanent state of existence for many inmates, including Silverstein. It was here that he would live, virtually unseen by the outside world, for decades. Silverstein's cell was a featureless box, offering little to no stimulation. The walls were made of concrete, and the only window was small, providing only a limited view of the world outside. For most of his time in ADX Florence, Silverstein would remain in this small cell, locked away for 23 hours a day with 1 hour outside, typically spent walking in a small, enclosed yard, alone. The isolation that Silverstein endured was not just physical, it was deeply psychological. Over time, the lack of human interaction and sensory deprivation took a toll on his mental health. Studies have shown that solitary confinement can lead to severe psychological effects, including depression, hallucinations, anxiety, and even suicidal thoughts. Silverstein was no exception. He experienced deep bouts of loneliness and despair. His thoughts became a swirling vortex of frustration, anger, and confusion. The walls of his cell, once mere barriers, became a suffocating prison of their own. The isolation was not the only thing that made Silverstein's time in ADX Florence so horrific. There were the constant, unrelenting sounds of the prison. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant clanging of cell doors, the occasional footsteps of guards patrolling the corridors. But more than anything, there was the oppressive silence. The lack of human voices. The absence of even a single conversation or word of comfort. It was this silence that became Silverstein's constant companion, and over the years, it began to erode his sense of self. Inmates in solitary confinement at ADX Florence were denied access to educational programs, recreational activities, and any form of meaningful social interaction. For many, this was the true form of punishment. But for Silverstein, the lack of human contact became something more than just a physical restriction. It became a weapon. a tool designed to strip away his humanity. Silverstein's case was complicated by the fact that, in addition to being isolated from the outside world, he was also cut off from his fellow prisoners. For many inmates, prison is a place where they form connections, however fractured, with others. But for Silverstein, there was no such interaction. His life was spent in complete isolation, with no one to share his thoughts or struggles. In a prison where even the most hardened criminals find a sense of belonging in their fellow inmates, Silverstein was alone, truly alone. One of the most disturbing aspects of Silverstein's time in ADX Florence was the sheer length of his confinement. It wasn't just a few months or even a few years. For 28 years, Silverstein lived in a world that was completely cut off from humanity. His existence was marked by long, uninterrupted stretches of isolation, broken only by brief encounters with guards or medical staff. This extended period of sensory deprivation had a profound impact on his mental health. Over the years, Silverstein began to experience symptoms that were consistent with severe psychological trauma, including memory loss, hallucinations, and a growing inability to connect with reality. One of the most significant effects of Silverstein's prolonged isolation was his decline into what some experts call prisonization. Prisonization refers to the process by which an individual becomes so entrenched in the prison system that they begin to lose touch with the outside world. For Silverstein, this meant that he became increasingly detached from reality. His world shrank to the confines of his cell, and his identity became defined by his time in solitary confinement. Over time, this psychological breakdown led Silverstein to a point where he no longer saw the world as a place he could engage with or affect. He became a man without hope, without a future. His existence reduced to little more than surviving the crushing isolation of his cell. Despite the severe toll that isolation took on his mind, Silverstein did not go quietly into the night. He resisted. In his own way, he fought against the crushing monotony of his life. He would occasionally write letters to outside organizations, trying to bring attention to his plight. He wrote letters to lawyers and activists, detailing the psychological toll of his imprisonment and the horrors of solitary confinement. But even in his attempts to communicate, Silverstein remained a prisoner of his own mind. His words, like his thoughts, were confined to the prison walls that separated him from the rest of the world. Silverstein's story is a tragic reflection of what happens when the prison system goes beyond punishment and crosses into the realm of cruelty. His case is a chilling reminder of the psychological and physical toll that solitary confinement can take on an individual. But Silverstein's experience is not unique. Thousands of men and women have spent decades in solitary confinement, enduring the same kind of isolation and deprivation. While the conditions at ADX Florence may be among the harshest in the country, the practice of solitary confinement is widespread throughout the American prison system. For Silverstein, there was no escape. He was trapped in a never-ending cycle of isolation, deprived of any sense of human connection. Even as his body began to fail him, Silverstein's mind remained locked in a prison of its own. And though he would eventually pass away in 2019, his story remains a powerful symbol of the dark side of the American prison system. His life and death highlight the profound cost of a system that places punishment over humanity, isolation over rehabilitation. As the years passed and Thomas Silverstein's time in solitary confinement at ADX Florence continued, his story became more than just one man's suffering. It became a symbol of the darker side of the American prison system. The extreme isolation, sensory deprivation, and psychological damage that Silverstein endured are not isolated incidents. They are part of a broader, deeply troubling reality that affects thousands of prisoners across the United States. The effects of solitary confinement go beyond the individual, extending to the prison system as a whole and the people who work within it. But despite the growing evidence of its damaging effects, solitary confinement remains a central tool in the management of prisoners in maximum security facilities like ADX Florence. Silverstein's case drew attention to the long-term consequences of prolonged isolation, sparking debates about the ethics and effectiveness of solitary confinement. The U.S. is one of the few countries in the world that still employs solitary confinement as a standard punishment for prisoners, and it is estimated that over 80,000 inmates across the country spend time in solitary confinement on any given day. While the practice is often justified as a necessary measure for controlling violent offenders, the evidence suggests that it may cause more harm than good. Psychologists and human rights activists have long argued that solitary confinement is a form of torture. The United Nations has declared that any form of solitary confinement lasting more than 15 days can be considered a violation of international human rights laws, and yet in the United States, many inmates spend years, even decades, in isolation. The effects of this isolation can be devastating, leading to long-term mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, hallucinations, and suicidal thoughts. But for those inside ADX Florence, these effects were part of the very fabric of their existence. The prison was designed to strip away everything that made a person human: their freedom, their dignity, their sense of self. For Silverstein, this meant living in a constant state of psychological distress, cut off from the outside world and from the basic human interactions that most people take for granted. His world, like that of many other inmates, became a place where time lost all meaning, and the outside world seemed like a distant memory. Despite the immense toll that solitary confinement took on Silverstein, his story was not one of complete resignation. Even in the darkest days of his confinement, Silverstein fought back against the dehumanization he experienced. His letters, written to human rights organizations, legal advocates, and even family members, were his attempts to reach out, to remind the world that he was still alive, still human, despite the system's best efforts to erase him. Through these letters, Silverstein became a symbol of the countless others who had been similarly isolated and forgotten. One of the most significant aspects of Silverstein's story is the way it highlighted the systemic issues within the American prison system. ADX Florence was built with the intention of housing the worst offenders, but over time, it became clear that the very design of the facility, and the policies that governed it, were a form of punishment that went beyond what was necessary to ensure safety. In the years since Silverstein's transfer to ADX Florence, the prison has become a focal point for debates about the ethics of solitary confinement and the treatment of prisoners in the U.S. criminal justice system. Many of Silverstein's fellow inmates at ADX Florence were also victims of the same system. Like him, they were subjected to years of isolation, their lives defined by the crushing silence of their cells and the relentless monotony of their days. These men, many of whom had committed violent crimes, were not given the opportunity to rehabilitate, to reflect on their actions, or to rejoin society. Instead, they were locked away in a system that seemed more interested in punishing them than helping them. In 2012, the U.S. government faced mounting pressure to address the issue of solitary confinement. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the American Civil Liberties Union (ACLU) all called for an end to the use of solitary confinement, particularly in cases where inmates were kept in isolation for extended periods. Despite the growing evidence of the harm it caused, the practice remained deeply ingrained in the American prison system. For many activists, the case of Thomas Silverstein was the catalyst that brought the issue of solitary confinement into the public consciousness. Silverstein's story, and the stories of countless others like him, forced people to confront the question: how far is too far when it comes to punishment? Can a system that dehumanizes its prisoners really be called justice? Silverstein's death in 2019 marked the end of an era for ADX Florence and for the many inmates who had spent years or decades in solitary confinement. But while his story ended, the fight against solitary confinement is far from over. In the years since his passing, advocacy groups have continued to push for reforms to the American prison system, calling for a reduction in the use of solitary confinement and for more humane treatment of prisoners. One of the most powerful arguments against solitary confinement is the evidence that it doesn't work. Contrary to the belief that isolation makes prisons safer, studies have shown that solitary confinement actually increases the likelihood of violent behavior among inmates once they are released. The psychological damage caused by years of isolation makes it harder for these individuals to reintegrate into society, leading to higher rates of recidivism and long-term mental health issues. The impact of solitary confinement also extends beyond the inmates themselves. Correctional officers and staff who work in facilities like ADX Florence are also affected by the environment. Many guards and prison workers report experiencing long-term trauma as a result of their work in high-security, isolated environments. The constant exposure to violence, fear, and despair can have a profound impact on their mental health as well. While Silverstein's story is one of the most extreme examples of solitary confinement, it is far from unique. Thousands of inmates across the United States continue to suffer in similar conditions. The practice of solitary confinement remains one of the most controversial and deeply troubling aspects of the U.S. criminal justice system, and it is clear that the need for reform is more urgent than ever. In recent years, there have been signs of progress. Some states have passed legislation to limit the use of solitary confinement, particularly for juveniles and individuals with mental health issues. However, these reforms are still in their infancy, and much more needs to be done to address the systemic issues that have allowed solitary confinement to persist in American prisons for so long. As we look back on the story of Thomas Silverstein, it serves as a powerful reminder of the cost of dehumanization, of the dangers of a prison system that is more concerned with punishment than rehabilitation. Silverstein's life and death have become a symbol of the horrors of solitary confinement, and his story continues to inspire those who fight for a more just and humane prison system. But the fight is far from over. The legacy of ADX Florence and the stories of those like Thomas Silverstein live on in the ongoing struggle to reform the U.S. prison system. Whether or not change will come remains to be seen, but one thing is clear: the conversation about solitary confinement is far from finished. And for those who have lived through the nightmare, the question remains: when will we stop punishing people by isolating them from humanity? As we step into the future of the American prison system, the question surrounding solitary confinement becomes even more urgent. The case of Thomas Silverstein, along with the stories of countless others who have experienced the brutal effects of prolonged isolation, forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. A system built on punishment and isolation may not be sustainable in the long term. Solitary confinement has been justified for decades as a necessary evil, a tool to control dangerous individuals. But the mounting evidence of its harmful psychological effects, both on inmates and the prison staff who maintain it, demands a rethinking of its use. Solitary confinement, particularly in places like ADX Florence, has been criticized not only for its cruelty but for its failure to achieve its intended purpose: rehabilitation and rehabilitation alone. The practice of isolating inmates for months, years, or even decades has been shown to foster increased aggression, mental health problems, and a higher risk of reoffending once released back into society. The harsh conditions inside solitary confinement cells often exacerbate the very issues they are meant to mitigate. Prisoners who are isolated for long periods experience intense feelings of helplessness, despair, and rage, which in turn makes reintegration into society more challenging, leading to a cycle of recidivism that plagues the criminal justice system. The devastating mental toll on prisoners such as Silverstein underscores the inhumanity of solitary confinement. It raises the question of whether our system, which is supposed to correct behavior, is instead deepening the trauma and suffering of those it is meant to punish. Even those who enter prison with a relatively stable mental state can leave in far worse condition, and many never recover from the years spent in isolation. Studies have shown that prolonged solitary confinement can lead to irreversible changes in brain function. It can cause depression, anxiety, hallucinations, and paranoia, effects that can last even after release. The systemic failure of solitary confinement has not gone unnoticed. In recent years, the issue has garnered increasing attention from human rights organizations, politicians, and activists. A 2015 report by the United Nations found that solitary confinement, when used for prolonged periods, constitutes a form of torture and violates international human rights laws. In the U.S., some states have taken steps to curb the use of solitary confinement. California, for example, implemented a policy in 2015 to reduce the use of solitary confinement in its prisons, particularly for vulnerable populations such as juveniles, the mentally ill, and those in need of medical care. These efforts represent the beginning of a broader conversation about how the U.S. prison system should evolve to better align with human rights principles and the goal of rehabilitation. But progress has been slow. The entrenched nature of solitary confinement within the U.S. criminal justice system makes it a difficult practice to reform. Despite widespread evidence of its detrimental effects, some correctional facilities continue to argue that it is necessary for the safety of the prison and the protection of both staff and inmates. ADX Florence, for example, remains one of the few places where solitary confinement is a permanent condition for many inmates. Some argue that it is still required to manage the most dangerous individuals, but at what cost? There is a growing movement in the U.S. to challenge the practice of solitary confinement, and voices from within the prison system itself are becoming louder. Former correctional officers, many of whom have worked in supermax prisons, have spoken out about the psychological toll their work has had on them. They report experiencing secondary trauma, emotional exhaustion, and burnout. The constant exposure to human suffering, coupled with the emotional toll of dealing with inmates who have been driven to despair, has led many to call for a shift in the way prisons are run. One of the key challenges in moving away from solitary confinement is finding alternative methods of managing high-risk prisoners. Advocates for reform suggest that prisons need to embrace rehabilitative measures rather than relying on punitive ones. Therapeutic approaches, mental health care, and education programs are seen as viable alternatives to isolation. Programs that focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment could provide inmates with the tools they need to reintegrate into society after their sentences are completed. However, this would require a fundamental shift in the way the U.S. prison system operates, and that kind of change doesn't come easily. Another challenge is the lack of resources allocated to mental health care within prisons. Many inmates, including those housed in solitary confinement, suffer from mental health conditions that exacerbate their violent tendencies. The solution, some argue, lies not in further isolation but in providing more comprehensive mental health services. Prisons like ADX Florence, with their emphasis on control and punishment, often fail to address the root causes of criminal behavior: mental illness, trauma, and a lack of education and opportunity. By focusing on rehabilitation and providing the necessary resources to treat mental health issues, the U.S. prison system could begin to break the cycle of violence and isolation that has plagued it for decades. For many, the most pressing question is not whether solitary confinement should be abolished, but how it should be reformed. What kind of system would it take to ensure that dangerous prisoners are kept under control without subjecting them to the psychological horror of isolation? How can prisons balance safety with humanity? It's a complex question with no easy answer, but the growing consensus is that the current approach is not sustainable. There are signs of hope. The continued public scrutiny of solitary confinement has led to more discussion, more research, and more efforts at reform. The stories of individuals like Thomas Silverstein have become a rallying cry for those who believe that the U.S. prison system can do better. But reforming such a deeply ingrained system will take time. It will require a cultural shift within the prison system, one that prioritizes rehabilitation over retribution, one that values human life and dignity even for those who have committed the worst crimes. As the fight against solitary confinement continues, the legacy of Thomas Silverstein will not be forgotten. His life, marked by years of unimaginable suffering, serves as a powerful reminder of the costs of our prison system's reliance on isolation. His death, along with the ongoing stories of others who have endured similar fates, has opened a national dialogue on the need for change. Thomas Silverstein's story is a stark reminder of the harsh realities of solitary confinement. The fight for prison reform is far from over. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for more.